I want you to picture something for me before we start. Picture a state that's basically two different worlds stitched together. You've got Chicago up in the corner, one of the biggest cities in the country, with all the density and anonymity that comes with that. And then you've got the rest of it. Hundreds of miles of flat farmland running south, small river towns, county seats where everybody supposedly knows everybody, a whole lot of interstate highway cutting straight through the middle of nowhere on the way to somewhere else. Illinois has both of those realities at once, and it turns out both of them can swallow a person whole. According to the Cook County Sheriff's Office, which runs a dedicated missing persons project specifically for cases that have gone unresolved for years, there are dozens of open cases in that county alone, drawn straight from the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Cases where somebody has been missing for 3 years or more with no resolution. That's just one county. The Charlie Project, which tracks long-term missing persons cases nationwide, has profiled more than 16,000 people, and a meaningful chunk of them disappeared somewhere in Illinois, going back decades. I'm not telling you that to scare you. I'm telling you because I think it's easy to assume that in a state with a city as big and as watched as Chicago, nobody could really just vanish without a trace. That there's always a camera, always a witness, always something. It isn't true. People have walked out of restaurants, off interstate shoulders, out of their own homes, and simply never been seen again, in towns you've heard of and towns you probably haven't. There's also something specific to Illinois worth understanding before we get into the individual cases. Because Chicago sits so close to the borders of Indiana and Wisconsin, and because Interstates 80, 55, 57, and 90 all cross through the state on their way to somewhere else entirely, a disappearance that starts in Illinois doesn't necessarily stay an Illinois case for long. A car can be found abandoned 3 states away. A body, when one is ever found, can turn up along a highway shoulder 500 miles from where somebody was last seen alive. That geography cuts both ways. It means Illinois cases sometimes get solved with help from neighboring states, and it also means jurisdiction and momentum can get tangled up in ways that slow an investigation downright when speed matters most. It's worth pausing on Cook County specifically for a second too, because of how it approaches this problem differently than a lot of places do. Most missing persons units are organized around whichever department happened to take the original report, meaning a case can sit inside one small suburban department's files for years, worked whenever an officer has spare time between more urgent calls. Cook County instead built a team whose entire job is going back through NamUs, pulling out Illinois cases that have gone cold for 3 years or more, and pushing them back out into public view on a rolling basis, regardless of which department originally opened the file. It's a small structural choice, but it means a case doesn't just quietly stop getting attention the moment the original detectives move on to other work. It also means a case can quietly slip between agencies in a way that isn't anyone's fault exactly, but still costs precious time. A county sheriff's department starts a search, a body or a car turns up in a different county or a different state entirely, and suddenly, 2 or 3 separate law enforcement agencies are all holding a piece of the same story without necessarily talking to each other in real time. Some of what you're about to hear reflects exactly that pattern: a disappearance in one town, a car found in another, and years of overlapping jurisdiction that never quite added up to a single complete picture. So today I want to walk you through some of the Illinois cases that never got closed. Not the handful you've maybe already seen turned into a true crime documentary a dozen times. I want to get into the ones that don't always make it into those specials. A Bolingbrook mother of 2 who never made it to help a friend paint a house. 2 young sisters who left a note about a walk to the store and never came home. An entire family that disappeared from a Chicago home within days of each other. A senior banquet captain who left his job at a Rockford resort one evening and never came home. A college freshman gone from an Oak Park street. A cluster of women who vanished from the same stretch of Peoria in the same handful of years. A 16-year-old girl from 1963 whose case is still, by one measure, the oldest unsolved disappearance in the entire state. And a few more whose stories deserve to be said out loud, even though almost nobody outside their own families has heard them in decades. I'm going to stick to what's actually known, what's been reported by police, by the families, by journalists and case databases who've spent years or decades on these stories. I'm not going to speculate wildly or turn anybody's tragedy into some kind of ghost story for entertainment, because these are real people with real families who are, in a lot of cases, still out there right now, still waiting, still hoping somebody watching this might remember something they didn't realize mattered. A quick word on how I put this together, because I think it matters. Everything you're about to hear comes from public police case files, official missing persons databases like the Charlie Project and NamUs, news coverage from Illinois outlets, and, where it exists, direct reporting from the families themselves. I'm not filling in gaps with guesses. Where something is genuinely unknown, and in almost every one of these cases, an enormous amount is genuinely unknown, I'm going to tell you that it's unknown instead of pretending there's a tidy explanation just to make the story feel more complete. These families have lived with real uncertainty for years or decades. The least I can do is not paper over that with something invented. I also want to say, before we start, that there is a real difference between a case that's been solved and a case where somebody has simply been found. Some of the names in this video might get an answer eventually, through DNA testing that didn't exist when they disappeared, the way it's already happened for other Illinois cases that aren't part of tonight's list. Cold cases going back 60 years that only got resolved because someone, somewhere, kept a sample preserved long enough for the technology to catch up. Some of the people we're about to talk about might already be alive somewhere, going by a different name, having built an entirely different life, with no idea that a family back in Illinois is still looking. Some of them, painfully, are very likely gone in the way we tend to fear the most when we use that word. I don't know which category any of these people fall into, and neither does anyone else. That's exactly what makes them missing, rather than something more final. All I can do is lay out what's known and let you sit with that, the same way their families have had to. If you know anything about any of these people, even something that seems small, even something you've been sitting on for years because you weren't sure if it was worth mentioning, it matters. I'll give you the contact information for each case as we go. Before we begin tonight's journey, if you enjoy true crime stories, I'd be honored to have you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes in the series. Your support helps this channel continue exploring the stories behind the places we call home. Now, let's begin. I want to start with the case that probably put Illinois missing persons cases on the national map more than any other in the last 20 years, because for a lot of people, this is the one that comes to mind first. Stacey Ann Peterson was 23 years old, a mother of 2 young children, living in Bolingbrook, a suburb southwest of Chicago. Her husband of 4 years, Drew Peterson, was a sergeant with the Bolingbrook Police Department at the time. He'd been on the force for 29 years. On the morning of October 28, 2007, Drew says he last saw Stacey leaving their home on Pheasant Chase Court at around 10 or 11 in the morning. She was supposed to go meet a friend to help paint a house. She never arrived. She was reported missing at 4 o'clock the following morning by her family, who said it was completely unlike her to disappear without a word, especially with 2 young kids at home waiting on her. Her cell phone was never used again after that morning. After she vanished, her purple 2-door 2002 Pontiac was found in the parking lot of Clough Airport, about 400 yards from the Peterson home. Drew told investigators that Stacy had told him she'd left it there herself and that he'd gone to retrieve it. Drew Peterson's explanation from the very beginning was that Stacy had left him for another man. Her family never believed that for a second. Her sister-in-law, Norma Peterson, has said publicly more than once that family meant everything to Stacy and that she would never have willingly left her children behind. What makes this case different from a lot of the others we'll talk about is what happened next, almost by accident. Stacy's disappearance prompted investigators to take a second look at the death of Drew's third wife, Kathleen Savio, who had been found dead in a dry bathtub in her home back in 2004. That death had originally been ruled an accident. Once Stacy went missing, and Drew became a suspect in her disappearance, prosecutors reopened the Savio case, had her body exhumed, and determined her death had actually been a homicide. In 2012, Drew Peterson was convicted of murdering Kathleen Savio. He was later also convicted, in 2016, in connection with a murder-for-hire plot targeting the Will County State's attorney who'd prosecuted that case. He is currently serving what amounts to a life sentence. He has never been charged in connection with Stacy's disappearance. He has always maintained that she is alive somewhere. Stacy's remains have never been found, despite an extraordinary, sustained search effort that has now stretched across close to 2 decades. Her sister, Cassandra Cales, has said in interviews that she has essentially devoted her life to searching for her. Over the years, Cales has commissioned private sonar searches of the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal and the Des Plaines River near the Lockport Powerhouse, a stretch of water close to the Peterson home that investigators have returned to more than once. In 2021, Cales told reporters she believed she'd located skeletal remains using advanced remote sonar equipment and turned the information over to Illinois State Police and the FBI. They searched the area. They found nothing conclusive. It wasn't the first time a promising lead in that canal had come up empty, and Cales has said she plans to keep searching regardless. Stacy would be in her early 40s today. What stayed with a lot of people who followed this case over the years is the strange asymmetry at the center of it. A man convicted of murdering one wife, suspected by nearly everyone including his own children of killing a second, and still legally never charged in connection with Stacy at all, because without a body, without a crime scene, prosecutors have never had enough to bring a case that would hold up in court. That gap between what almost everyone believes happened and what can actually be proven in a courtroom is part of what's kept her sister searching that canal for going on 2 decades now. If you have any information about her disappearance from Bolingbrook on October 28, 2007, Illinois State Police and the Will County Sheriff's Office still consider this case open. This next case is one that a lot of people in Chicago still remember vividly, because at the time, it triggered one of the largest searches in the city's history, and it's a case that took a genuinely strange turn more than 20 years after it began. Tracy Bradley was a single mother living in an apartment near 35th Street and Cottage Grove Avenue on Chicago's South Side in the 3,500 block of South Lake Park Avenue. On the morning of Friday, July 6, 2001, she left for work at around 6:30, leaving her 10-year-old daughter, Tianda, in charge of her 3-year-old sister, Diamond. 2 of the family's other daughters, ages 12 and 9, were spending the night at their grandmother's apartment, a completely unremarkable arrangement for a family with 4 kids and a single working parent, trying to make an ordinary Friday function. When Tracy came home around 11 that morning, or by some accounts closer to noon, the apartment was silent. Tianda and Diamond were gone. In their place, Tracy found a note, apparently written by Tianda, saying the 2 girls were going to walk to a nearby store and then to the playground at their school. Tianda was actually enrolled in summer classes at Doolittle Elementary at the time, but school officials later confirmed she'd been marked absent that day. Tracy didn't call police until around 6:30 that evening, meaning the girls had already been missing for at least 6 hours by the time an official search began. What followed was, by most accounts, one of the largest manhunts in Chicago's history up to that point, with police and volunteers combing the surrounding neighborhood for any sign of the sisters. They found nothing. As investigators dug deeper, the case grew stranger. A voicemail was later discovered that Tianda had apparently left that same morning, mentioning that a man named George was at the door, believed to be a reference to George Washington, who was Diamond's father and someone Tracy had been seeing. That voicemail was reportedly deleted at some point during the investigation, a detail that's never been fully explained. Investigators also noted that Tracy missed several scheduled appointments with detectives over the following months, which did nothing to quiet the suspicion already circling the case. For years, the family held on to hope, fueled periodically by people claiming to be one of the missing sisters. In 2019, a woman came forward saying she was one of the Bradley girls. Grown up. DNA testing and further investigation determined she wasn't. Tracy Bradley has said publicly, more than once, that she still believes in her heart her daughters are alive somewhere, and that she hopes to be reunited with them one day. Then in 2023, more than 20 years after the girls vanished, Tracy reportedly admitted, in an account later described by researchers and journalists following the case, that she had not been entirely truthful with police from the very beginning, out of fear that admitting the full truth of what happened that morning might have led to her losing custody of her surviving children to the state's child welfare system. The exact nature of what she'd concealed and how directly it connects to what actually happened to Tianda and Diamond has never been made fully public, and the case remains open and unsolved. In 2021, on the 20th anniversary of their disappearance, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released new age-progressed photos showing what Tianda and Diamond might look like as adults. Tianda in her early 30s, Diamond in her mid-20s. There's a reward of up to $10,000 still standing for information leading to their whereabouts. What makes this case so uniquely painful, even among the others on this list, is how many different true stories seem to be tangled up inside it at once. There's the story of two little girls who genuinely might have walked to a store and a playground and encountered something horrible along the way, exactly as the note said. There's the story implied by that deleted voicemail of a man at the door on a morning when he wasn't supposed to be there. And there's the story that only came into focus decades later of a mother who, by her own later account, wasn't able to tell investigators everything she knew at the time because she was afraid of what it would cost her, afraid of losing the daughter she still had left, on top of the two she'd already lost. None of those threads cancel each other out. They can all be partially true at once, which is part of why, more than 20 years on, nobody has ever been able to close this file with any real confidence. Their two older sisters, who spent that night at their grandmother's house and were spared whatever happened, grew up in the shadow of that unanswered question. And Tracy Bradley has had to raise them while carrying both her grief and, eventually, the public scrutiny that came with admitting she hadn't told the whole truth from the start. If you have any information about Tianda or Diamond Bradley, contact the Chicago Police Department or the FBI's Chicago Field Office. This next case is one of the hardest ones I came across while putting this together, because it isn't just one person who disappeared, it's four. Everett Thompson Sr. owned a restaurant called EAT and Company in the Park Manor neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. He lived in the 8100 block of South Rhodes Avenue with his wife Lydia and their two sons, Everett Jr. and 8-year-old Andrew. The home had originally belonged to Lydia's father, who had passed it down to his 3 children, so Lydia and her 2 siblings each held a 1/3 share of the property. In February of 1996, Lydia's brother Kenneth White moved into the house after his release from prison, where he'd served time for rape. The family was unhappy about the arrangement almost from the start. Everett's side of the family referred to White as a freeloading house guest. On July 3rd, about 4 months after he moved in, Lydia called 911 and reported that White had threatened to kill her with an axe. Police responded, but by the time they arrived, the confrontation had died down, and they left without making an arrest. 2 days later, on July 5th, Everett's father called him at the restaurant. Their conversation started out completely normal. Partway through it, Lydia called Everett frantic, saying that Kenneth had chased her around the house with an axe and that she'd locked herself in the bedroom. Everett told his father what was happening, ended the call, and left the restaurant immediately. One of his employees was the last person to ever see him. 2 hours later, Kenneth White showed up at the restaurant driving Everett's van. He told the manager that Everett had been arrested after a car accident, and then he left. The manager noticed something odd. White was wearing white sneakers with red smears on them. 12 days passed. On July 17th, Everett's parents, unable to reach anyone in the family, asked police to check on the house. Officers went to the Thompson home and found only Kenneth White, who told them his sister and her family had taken an impromptu vacation to Philadelphia, where Everett had been born and where his parents still lived. Police found no evidence of foul play at the house, and the fact that the family's van was missing seemed to support White's story. They left without investigating further. Over the following weeks, White told wildly inconsistent versions of the same story to different people. Sometimes the family had taken a bus to Philadelphia, sometimes to Minneapolis. Once he claimed they'd gone to Hawaii. Around this time, he was arrested for forging Lydia's signature on a check while driving the Thompsons' van. But police at the time didn't connect that arrest to the story he'd told them earlier about the family's whereabouts. By late July, Everett's parents had traveled to Chicago themselves, trying to track down the family on their own, speaking to employees at the restaurant, getting nowhere. They pushed police to investigate further. A restaurant employee eventually told officers about White's strange story regarding Everett's supposed arrest, but there was no record anywhere of Everett being arrested or involved in any traffic accident. Imagine making that trip yourself, flying or driving into a city where your son and his whole family have gone silent, walking into a restaurant you don't own, asking employees you've never met whether they've seen your grandchildren, and getting nothing but a shrug and a second-hand story about a car accident that never happened. It got worse from there. Investigators learned that while the family was missing, Kenneth had forged both Lydia's and her sister's signatures on documents in order to sell the family home. A home inspector who visited before the sale noticed that a toilet and a bathtub had recently been painted red, and that the kitchen floor had been torn out, none of which had been true when police examined the house on July 3rd. By the time authorities uncovered the illegal sale, the new owners had already gutted the house for renovation, destroying whatever evidence might have remained inside. Police interviewed White multiple times, but never had enough for an arrest. He eventually moved into a trailer in Gary, Indiana. In July of 1997, the FBI searched his trailer and the surrounding property and found a pair of men's gym shoes and a boy's sock, both blood-stained. That November, White was arrested for failing to register as a sex offender. The following month, he was arrested again, this time for bank fraud, accused of forging Lydia's name on a check for over $13,000. During a hearing on that fraud charge, a prosecutor stated outright that investigators believed White had axe-murdered the Thompson family, theorizing that he wanted the house to himself and killed his sister, her husband, and their 2 children to get it. On Christmas Day, 1997, Kenneth White hanged himself in jail. He left no note. He never revealed anything about what had actually happened to the family. Investigators believe the Thompsons were likely killed on July 5th or 6, 1996, but there was never enough evidence to charge White while he was alive, and searches of both his trailer in Indiana and the Thompson home in Chicago never turned up any human remains. Everett Thompson Sr., Lydia Thompson, Everett Thompson Jr., and 8-year-old Andrew Thompson have never been found. Andrew would be in his late 30s today. There's an age-progressed image of him that the Charlie Project has updated over the years, showing what he might look like now. What makes this case so different from almost everything else on this list is the sheer scale of what had to happen for it to stay unsolved. It isn't one person disappearing quietly. It's 4 people, a business owner, his wife, and their 2 sons, vanishing from a home where police had already been called once for a documented axe threat, followed by weeks of a family member telling contradictory stories to everyone he spoke to, followed by a forged sale of the family's own house, followed by a renovation that destroyed the scene before investigators even realized what they were looking at. Every single step along the way represented a chance for someone to catch what was happening faster than they did, and every single one of those chances slipped past. By the time the full picture came into focus, there was nothing left to find. If you have any information about the Thompson family, contact the Chicago Police Department. I want to tell you about a case that starts out looking like it might have a happy resolution, and then just stops, leaving a family in a strange kind of limbo that's arguably worse than a clean answer either way. James Kimball disappeared from his family's home in Oak Park, a suburb just west of Chicago, in 1993. His family began an extensive search almost immediately after realizing he was gone, and in the process, they learned he'd stopped showing up to work shortly after walking away from the house. Nearly a year later, in March of 1994, an Indiana law enforcement officer came across a young man matching James's description wandering aimlessly outside South Bend, Indiana, about 90 miles from Oak Park. The man appeared confused, and the officer, suspecting intoxication, gave him a field sobriety test. He passed it and was released. It wasn't until afterward that the officer saw one of the Kimball family's missing person flyers and realized the man he'd released might have been James. By then, there was no way to find him again. He'd been let go, with nothing on record connecting him to any case, and he vanished right back into wherever he'd come from. Authorities believe James may have been taken against his will at some point, though the full circumstances of his original disappearance from Oak Park have never been explained. What makes this case sit so strangely with a lot of people who read about it is that single, confirmed encounter, almost a year later, proof, or at least strong evidence, that James was alive at that point, wandering confused just 90 miles from home, and then gone again before anyone realized who he was. It's one of the closest calls in any case on this list, and it still ended in nothing. I keep thinking about that officer, honestly. He did everything right in the moment. He stopped, he checked, he administered a sobriety test out of genuine concern for someone who seemed disoriented. It just wasn't enough, because the system that would have told him this confused young man matches an active missing persons case 90 miles away simply didn't move fast enough, or wasn't connected well enough to catch up with what was happening in real time. That's part of why cases like this one are part of the reason larger, faster sharing databases like Nameuse eventually got built, not to replace good instincts on the ground, but to make sure a good instinct has the information it needs behind it. It's also worth sitting with what confused and wandering might actually mean in this context. It could point toward drugs, toward a head injury, toward some kind of psychiatric crisis, or toward the disorientation of someone who'd simply been through something none of us would handle well either. Investigators have never been able to say which, because by the time anyone realized who they'd briefly had in custody, there was nothing left to examine. No blood draw, no photograph beyond the officer's memory, no way to go back and ask better questions of a man who was, however briefly, right there in front of someone who could have brought him home. Maywood, Illinois authorities have handled the investigation. If you have any information about James Donald Kimball, or if you were anywhere near South Bend, Indiana, in March of 1994, that case remains open. This next case shows how murky a disappearance can get when the missing person's own life was already complicated before they vanished. Lourdes Contreras was born in Jalisco, Mexico, and had been living in Aurora, Illinois, for about 5 years before she disappeared. She'd worked at a hospital at one point and was living in the 1000 block of North Avenue. Law enforcement had contact with her on July 5, 2002. Her family last heard from her sometime in August of that year. Because most of her relatives lived out of state, it took a while before anyone realized how long it had actually been since anyone had heard from her. Her uncle didn't report her missing until October 3, 2002, roughly 2 months after that last contact. The next day, her pickup truck was found outside a Target store in Naperville, Illinois. Here's the detail that makes this case harder to read than most. At the time she disappeared, Lourdes was reportedly the subject of a federal narcotics investigation, though no charges were ever filed against her. Investigators have never been able to determine whether that investigation had anything to do with her disappearance, or whether it's simply a troubling coincidence layered on top of an already difficult case. The circumstances surrounding what actually happened to her remain unclear more than 2 decades later. Cases like Lourdes's tend to get quietly deprioritized in a way that isn't fair to the person at the center of them. When somebody's name is attached to any kind of ongoing investigation, even one that never results in charges, it can shape how seriously a disappearance gets taken from the very beginning, as though being the subject of scrutiny somehow makes a person less deserving of a thorough search. That's not how any of this should work, and it's worth saying plainly. Whatever Lourdes may or may not have been involved in, she was still somebody's family member, and the not knowing has landed on people who had nothing to do with any of it. There's also the 2-month gap to consider, the stretch between her last contact with family in August and the missing persons report in October. Most of her relatives lived out of state, which meant nobody nearby was checking in on a regular enough basis to notice her absence right away. It's a pattern that shows up more than once in tonight's video. Cases where the person who vanished didn't have a tight local support network keeping daily tabs on them, and where that absence of routine contact bought whoever was responsible weeks of head start before anyone even started looking. If you have any information about Lourdes Contreras, her case remains open with Illinois authorities. I want to tell you about a case where the tip that came in afterward might be true, might be a cruel hoax, and nobody has ever been able to tell the difference. Jamie Harper left her mother's home in Paxton, Illinois on March 9, 2007, to go to a party in Rantoul, a town about 20 miles away, with a male companion. The gathering was in the 1300 block of Laurel Drive. Jamie left early on the morning of March 10th. She never made it home, and she's never been heard from since. Her mother didn't report her missing until the following week, not out of neglect, but because Jamie had, in the past, failed to come home for several days at a stretch before eventually turning up. This time was different, though nobody knew that yet. When she finally was reported missing, all of her possessions were still at home, including her medication. Sometime after Jamie's disappearance, an anonymous caller told police that she had died of a drug overdose and that her body had been left in an area of Paxton known locally as Dogtown, a stretch of land containing 3 gravel pits that has, over the years, become the site of numerous missing person searches in the area. Police searched Dogtown. They found nothing connected to Jamie's case, and the anonymous tip has never been verified one way or the other. Jamie's case sits in an unusually cruel kind of limbo, even compared to the others on this list. There's a specific story out there about what might have happened to her, complete with a location, but no way to confirm or dismiss it. Her family has had to live with that particular kind of not knowing, an answer that might be sitting right there, unconfirmed, for going on 2 decades. I think about how differently this case would read if that tip had never come in at all. A family with no leads, at least, has the clarity of knowing they're waiting for something, anything, to surface. A family with an unverified tip like this one has to hold 2 realities at once. The version where their daughter is still out there somewhere, and the version where the answer has already been sitting in a specific patch of gravel pits for 20 years, unconfirmed only because nobody was ever able to prove it either way. Neither version lets anyone rest. It's also worth mentioning why Jamie's mother waited that extra week before reporting her missing, because it's a detail that shows up in some form throughout tonight's video, a pattern of behavior that had been normal before suddenly becoming the thing that cost precious early time in a case that turned out to be anything but normal. Nobody can blame a parent for learning over years not to panic every time an adult child goes quiet for a few days. That's a reasonable adaptation to a real pattern. It just happens to be the exact adaptation that works against you, the one time the pattern breaks. If you have any information about Jamie Harper or about that anonymous tip regarding Dogtown and Paxton, her case remains open. This next case involves a man with a steady job, a normal routine, and a disappearance that starts out looking almost mundane before it quietly turns strange. Mark Miller worked as a senior banquet captain at the Clock Tower Resort and Conference Center in Rockford, Illinois. He was last seen leaving his job there on March 12, 2009. He never made it home to his residence in the 300 block of Whitman Avenue, and he's never been heard from again. Investigators eventually located his car, a silver 1998 Chrysler New Yorker, abandoned in the 1900 block of Harlem Boulevard, about a mile from his home. Authorities believe it had been parked there sometime on the evening of March 14th or the morning of March 15th, meaning Mark, or at least his car, was still moving around Rockford for 2 or 3 days after he was last seen at work. There was no evidence of a struggle found at either his home or inside the vehicle. 3 years later, in 2012, ATV riders at the Rocky Glen Off-Highway Vehicle Park in South Rockford found Mark's wallet in an area that's normally underwater. Human remains were discovered nearby around the same time, and for a while, investigators and the family believed they might have finally found him. The remains turned out to belong to someone else entirely. Mark's briefcase and car keys have never been located, and neither has Mark himself. There's something particularly unsettling about a case where the missing person's belongings keep surfacing in pieces, years apart, in places that don't obviously connect to each other. A wallet in a dry patch of an ATV park 3 years later. A car a mile from home 2 or 3 days after he was last seen, and nothing else ever to tie it together into an actual explanation. It's the kind of case that never quite lets a family exhale, because just often enough, something turns up to reopen the question all over again, only to close it just as quickly with a different, unrelated answer. Rockford investigators have had to walk a strange line with this case for over 15 years now, treating every new piece of physical evidence as a potential breakthrough, only to have each one turn into another dead end. The Rocky Glen discovery in particular must have been an agonizing few days for Mark's family. Between the moment the remains were found near his wallet and the moment DNA testing confirmed they belonged to somebody else entirely. That's a specific kind of hope and loss that a lot of families on this list have had to go through more than once. It's worth noting, too, how much this case depends on recreational land use for whatever partial evidence has surfaced. The wallet wasn't found by a detective working a lead. It was found by ATV riders out doing something completely unrelated to Mark's case, in a spot that happened to be dry that particular week when it's normally underwater. That's not a criticism of how Rockford PD has handled the investigation. It's just a reminder of how much of what we know about any of these cases across the whole state depends on ordinary chance encounters rather than deliberate searches. Somebody has to be in the right spot, looking down at the right moment, for evidence like that to ever surface at all. If you have any information about Mark Allen Miller, his case remains open with the Rockford Police Department. If you're still with me tonight, thank you. A quick like lets YouTube know to share it with other true crime fans, and I'd love to hear in the comments where you're listening from, or which state you'd like us to visit in a future episode. Reading your comments is one of my favorite parts of creating these stories. This case has a piece of hard physical evidence right at the center of it, a car crash, and it still hasn't been enough to explain what actually happened. Dylan Scott was last seen in rural Bureau County, Illinois, on February 28, 2016. In the middle of the night, at around 3 a.m, his green 1994 Cadillac struck a guardrail on Route 29 near Echo Bluff Park, just west of Spring Valley. The car sustained relatively minor damage to the front end in the crash. Dylan had a minor criminal record. He'd been convicted years earlier of stealing scrap metal at 18 years old and was on probation for it. What he apparently didn't know was that just 3 days before he disappeared, a warrant had been issued for his arrest for violating that probation. His family doesn't believe that warrant had anything to do with his disappearance, even if he had somehow learned about it, because by all accounts, he'd worked hard to put his life back together and had been doing well in the months before he vanished. He never picked up a single one of his monthly Social Security checks after he went missing, checks that were his only source of income at the time, which makes voluntary disappearance a much harder theory to accept. Police have said publicly that they don't see evidence of foul play in the case. Dylan's family disagrees. They believe he may not have even been the one driving the car when it struck that guardrail, and they've said they believe he was murdered. Nearly a decade later, nobody has been able to prove either version of events. His case remains unsolved. What strikes me about Dylan's case is how much weight ends up resting on a single unanswered question. Was he behind the wheel or not? And how little anyone outside his immediate family seems to have been able to do to answer it. A minor crash on a rural highway at 3 a.m. doesn't usually draw the kind of forensic attention that a body or a crime scene does. There was a car. There was damage. There wasn't a person. And in the gap between those facts, his family has spent 9 years arguing for a version of events that nobody has been able to either prove or fully dismiss. The detail about the Social Security checks is the one that seems to matter most to Dylan's family, and it's not hard to understand why. Nearly every other explanation for a young man's sudden disappearance involves some plausible reason he might choose to walk away from his old life. Debt, trouble with the law, a relationship falling apart, a desire to start over somewhere new. But those checks were his only income, arriving automatically whether he was there to collect them or not, and he never touched a single one after February 28, 2016. Whatever explanation eventually accounts for Dylan's disappearance, it has to account for that too. A young man who, by every practical financial measure, simply stopped needing money at all. If you have any information about Dylan Harley Scott or about that stretch of Route 29 near Echo Bluff Park in the early morning hours of February 28, 2016, his case remains open. I want to shift now to a pattern that's genuinely difficult to look at directly, because it isn't one disappearance, it's several, from the same stretch of the same city, within a handful of years of each other, and the man investigators have long suspected may be connected to at least some of them died without ever answering for it. Cheryl Louise Murray was last seen in Peoria, Illinois, on April 1, 1994. She was 43 years old, sometimes went by the last name Smith, and had a distinguishing feature investigators noted carefully. Her right middle finger had been amputated at the first knuckle. She has never been heard from again, and more than 3 decades on, her file remains one of the thinnest in this entire video, with almost nothing beyond that basic description ever having been made public. Stephanie Gibson's case gives us the clearest, most specific thread of any of them. She was last seen leaving Memories, a bar in the 800 block of Main Street in Peoria, at around 2:30 in the morning on July 8, 1995. She left with a man named Arlie Ray Davis, and the two of them drove off together in his car, a light blue 4-door 1979 Dodge Dart. Davis later told investigators that he and Stephanie had gone on to a place called Kingston Mines afterward, but no evidence was ever found to support that claim. She has never been heard from again. Loretta Tinkham's case sits alongside those two with far less detail attached to it. She was 30 years old, had red hair worn shoulder length, and was last seen in the Peoria area, reported missing on November 3, 1994. Almost nothing beyond that basic outline has ever become public, which is part of why her name so rarely appears outside of case databases and the occasional anniversary mention in local coverage. There was also a woman named Cheryl Merwin who vanished from Peoria that same year, 1994. Her case took a different path than the others. Her skull was eventually found in 2001 and formally identified in 2003, giving her family at least a partial answer that Cheryl's, Stephanie's, and Loretta's families have never received. The man at the center of all of this, Arlie Ray Davis, sometimes recorded in news coverage as Ari Ray Davis, was active in the Peoria area throughout this period. Sex workers who'd had contact with him described him as someone who enjoyed strangling and beating them during the early 1990s. Investigators later said he appeared to suffer from a sexual dysfunction and harbored a deep sense of inferiority toward women. Davis was eventually convicted of murdering one Illinois woman in the late 1990s and was sentenced to death. He consistently maintained his innocence, including in the other disappearances investigators wondered about. According to news coverage from the time, he died 5 days before a scheduled hearing on whether he should remain on death row of a heart attack in October of 2002. Authorities have never been able to establish for certain whether Davis was connected to Cheryl Murray's disappearance, Stephanie Gibson's, or Loretta Tinkham's. Even with Gibson's case, where he's the last known person to have seen her alive, prosecutors were never able to build a case that held up. It's possible all 3 women crossed paths with him. It's also possible some or all of their cases have nothing to do with him at all. To make an already difficult picture even murkier, the Peoria area in this same general period saw other women go missing under suspicion of an entirely separate offender. Valerie Sloan, 20 years old and from Peoria, and Stacy Morrison, 25, and from nearby Pekin, both went missing in 1993. Police have said they believe those 2 women were victims of a different man, a serial killer named Joseph Miller, rather than Davis. In 2001, investigators searching a creek near Edwards, Illinois, along Route 8, close to where 2 other murder victims had already been found dumped in the preceding year, recovered a set of bones and tried to determine whether they belonged to any of the missing women from either case. Several unidentified female remains have surfaced in and around the Peoria area over the years since, and investigators have said they don't believe most of them are connected to this specific cluster of missing women, meaning that even the physical evidence that keeps surfacing hasn't managed to close any of these individual files. What I find hardest to sit with about Peoria in the 1990s is how it looks, from a distance, less like one mystery and more like an entire regional pattern. Women, many of them in vulnerable circumstances, disappearing from roughly the same few square miles across a 5 or 6 year stretch, apparently connected to at least 2 different men, one of whom died on death row still denying everything, and the other of whom, as far as public reporting shows, was never definitively tied to any of the disappearances at all. Cheryl Murray would be in her mid-70s today. If you have any information about her or about Stephanie Gibson, Loretta Tinkham, Valerie Sloan, or Stacey Morrison, contact the Illinois State Police. There's a particular kind of injustice built into clusters like this one that's worth naming directly. When several women go missing from the same small area within a few years of each other, and several of them were, at least at times, working in the sex trade, it's historically been far too easy for both the public and even investigators to treat those disappearances as somehow less urgent than others, as though the circumstances of a person's life determine how hard anyone should look for them once they're gone. Peoria's own newspaper coverage from the period pushed back against that instinct, keeping these women's names in print year after year, specifically because nobody else was reliably doing it. That's part of why their names are still findable today, and part of why I wanted to include them here rather than let a whole cluster of disappearances get reduced to a single paragraph in someone else's case file. I want to end the individual cases with the oldest one on this list, because it shows that vanished and never found isn't a modern problem tied to highways or cell phones. This one goes back to 1963, and it might be the single strangest case I came across while researching this whole video. Marianne Switowski was 16 years old, living with her parents and younger sister in the 6200 block of West Cornelia Avenue in Chicago. She was a good student, had just finished her junior year at Notre Dame High School, had already put a deposit down on her senior yearbook and class ring, and worked a part-time job at a neighborhood store along with babysitting on the side. By every account, her parents weren't aware of any problems in her life. On the evening of July 15th, 1963, Marianne went with friends to a carnival at St. Priscilla's Catholic Church, about a mile from her home. She was last seen leaving the carnival at 10:15 that night, wearing a black sleeveless blouse, white shorts, and straw sandals. Her family never saw her again. 2 days later, though, something happened that makes this case unlike almost anything else on this list. Her parents received a letter. It was postmarked from Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb where the family often went shopping. In it, Marianne wrote that she was fine, that she was experiencing a strange but educational experience, and that she planned to send them money soon. She wouldn't say where she was, explaining that she didn't want anyone to interfere, and she added that she might never see her parents or friends again, but she promised to call them. That single letter is the reason Marianne's case gets classified differently than a lot of the others in this video. Officially, hers sits somewhere between a runaway case and an abduction, because there's genuine physical evidence she was alive and functioning independently at least 2 days after she vanished, even if nothing about what came after that has ever been confirmed. She never did. That letter is the last confirmed contact anyone has ever had with Marianne Switowski. Investigators eventually established that after leaving the carnival, Mary Ann had apparently joined a door-to-door magazine sales organization that was, at the time, heading toward California. When police questioned the couple who ran the group, they gave conflicting accounts. The wife said Mary Ann had left the group at some point along the way. The husband claimed she'd never left Chicago at all. 4 years later, in 1967, a man named Alan J. Silver was arrested in New York on robbery charges. It turned out Silver had run a magazine sales group that was operating in Chicago around the time Mary Ann disappeared, and investigators took a serious interest. A retired investigator who'd worked the case from the beginning later told the Chicago Tribune she believed Silver's group was the same one Mary Ann had joined. Nothing about the mismatched statements from the couple or the connection to Silver was ever fully resolved into an actual answer. By the time investigators were following that thread, Mary Ann had already been gone for 4 years, long enough for an entirely new life to have been built somewhere else, or for any physical evidence connected to her original disappearance to have long since vanished along with her. Mary Ann's parents ran personal ads in newspapers for years afterward, pleading with her to get in touch. She would be close to 80 years old today, making her, according to National Center for Missing and Exploited Children records, the longest missing person from the state of Illinois still listed in their database. There are 3 competing theories that have circulated for decades: that she's alive somewhere and simply chose never to go home, that she was sold or trafficked through the sales organization and something happened to her along the way, or that she met with foul play entirely separate from the group and the letter was somehow staged or coerced. More than 60 years later, there's still no way to prove or rule out any of them. I find myself returning to that line from her letter more than almost anything else in this entire video. A strange but educational experience. It's such a specific, oddly formal phrase for a 16-year-old to use, and investigators at the time apparently noticed the same thing, that the handwriting looked like hers, but the way of talking didn't quite sound like her. 60 years later, nobody has ever been able to explain that gap or say for certain whether it means anything at all. It might just be a teenager trying to sound older and more in control than she felt, writing to parents she knew would be frantic, or it might be someone else's words, put in her hand. That single sentence has outlived nearly everyone who was alive to read it the first time, and it still doesn't have an answer attached to it. If you have any information about Mary Ann Switalski, contact the Chicago Police Department or the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. I don't want to give the impression that 8 sections is anywhere close to the full picture, so before we move toward a close, I want to read a few more names into the record, even briefly, because every one of them deserves to be said somewhere out loud. Christine Daniels was last seen in Chicago, Illinois on May 30th, 1980. She has never been heard from again. Very few details about her case have ever become public. One of those files that stayed thin for well over 40 years now, with almost nothing beyond the date and the city to go on. April Zane was last seen in Frankfort, Illinois in 1977. She would be in her mid-60s today, and hers is one of a small handful of Illinois cases where the missing person has now been gone for close to 50 years, filed away in the same national database that still lists Mary Ann Switalski as the state's longest unsolved disappearance. Andrew Thompson's own case file, as we covered, sits inside the larger tragedy of his whole family. But it's worth remembering that of the 4 Thompsons who vanished in July of 1996, Andrew was the only child, 8 years old, and remains one of the youngest names on this entire list, alongside Diamond Bradley, who was only 3. On National Missing Children's Day, a couple of years ago, the FBI noted that there were, at that point, 119 missing children from Illinois still listed in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's long-running database, some gone for months, some, like a Chicago child who would now be in their 70s, gone for well over 60 years. 7 of those Illinois cases involve people who are now over the age of 60 themselves, meaning the missing child in the file is, by now, technically a senior citizen if they're alive at all. That's a strange, quiet kind of statistic to sit with, a reminder that missing children as a category doesn't age out. The file just keeps getting older, right along with everyone who once knew them. These are the kinds of cases that rarely get a documentary or a podcast season built around them on their own. They get a short entry on a cold case database, updated once every few years when a volunteer researcher or a family member adds a new detail, and a family that keeps hoping in something closer to silence than to public attention. Before I close this out, I want to talk for a minute about why cases like these are worth revisiting years or even decades later, instead of just letting them sit in a filing cabinet somewhere. It helps to understand the scale of what we're actually talking about. According to the FBI's National Crime Information Center, well over 600,000 people go missing or turn up unidentified across the United States in a given year. Most of those cases resolve quickly. Someone finds their way home or gets located within days. But NAMUS, the national database built to track the ones that don't resolve quickly, currently lists more than 21,000 active missing persons cases and close to 14,000 active unidentified persons cases at any given time. Researchers who've studied that database have found that women are more likely than men to end up missing specifically because of violence, which lines up uncomfortably well with how many of the names in tonight's video belong to women and girls. Put next to those national numbers, the dozen or so cases we've walked through tonight are a small specific slice of something much larger, which is exactly why I picked cases spread across so many decades and so many different kinds of towns, from a Southside Chicago apartment to a rural highway shoulder in Bureau County. No single case here is representative of all missing persons cases. Together, though, they start to sketch the actual range of what missing can mean in one state alone. The honest truth is that the tools available to investigators now are not the tools that were available even 10 or 15 years ago, let alone back in 1963 or 1980. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same kind of DNA science that's been used to catch serial killers who evaded capture for decades, has increasingly been turned toward the opposite problem, giving names back to people who lost theirs, and in some cases, finally identifying remains that had been sitting unclaimed for years, the way Cheryl Merwin's skull eventually was after being found in 2001 and identified 2 years later, or the way a homicide victim's remains found in western Illinois all the way back in 1966 were finally identified just this year as a missing California teenager, 60 years after he disappeared. That kind of identification doesn't happen for every family, and it doesn't happen on any predictable timeline. But it shows you that a case sitting cold for 10, 20, even 60 years is not necessarily a case that stays unsolved forever, provided the evidence is preserved and somebody keeps the file open long enough for the science to catch up. That's part of why NAMUS exists in the first place, and why offices like the Cook County Sheriff's dedicated Missing Persons Project keep actively pulling cases directly from that database and pushing for public attention on them, sometimes years after the original investigating department has run out of new leads to chase on its own. If a missing person's DNA profile is already on file, it can be automatically compared against unidentified remains found anywhere in the country, today or 20 years from now, without anyone having to manually connect the dots first. The Illinois State Police Clearinghouse for Missing Persons exists for the same basic reason: to make sure information about a disappearance in one corner of the state doesn't just sit isolated in one department's files, disconnected from everything else. It's also worth understanding just how much of this work rests on family members refusing to let a case go quiet. Almost every name in this video has, somewhere behind it, a sister who spent years commissioning private sonar searches, a set of grandparents who drove from another state to knock on doors themselves, a mother who waited an extra week to report a disappearance because it had happened before and this time turned out to be different, a father distributing flyers on foot through downtown Chicago because it was the only thing he could physically do with his hands while he waited for news. None of that replaces professional investigation, and none of it should have to carry the weight it sometimes does. But it's part of the honest picture of how these cases actually stay alive between the moments when new evidence shows up. Illinois specifically has ended up with a small ecosystem of volunteer-run efforts that exist purely to keep these names visible in between official updates. Public registries built by ordinary people with no law enforcement authority at all. Just a willingness to keep a case page updated, a poster shareable, a name searchable. They don't investigate. They can't. But they make sure that if somebody somewhere finally does remember the detail that matters, there's still a place for that memory to land and a phone number attached to it. That kind of quiet, unpaid persistence doesn't get much credit, but it's a real part of why some of tonight's cases still have any public visibility at all, decades after the original news coverage dried up. Sites like these exist entirely on donated time, and they're often the only place where a case like Loretta Tinkham's or April Zane's gets updated at all in a given year. Not because law enforcement has forgotten them, but because there's simply nothing new to report, and somebody still needs to be the one keeping the page online regardless. So that's 12 names, plus a family of 4, plus a cluster of women from Peoria whose cases have never been fully sorted out from each other. Stacy, Tianda and Diamond Bradley, Everett, Lydia, Everett Jr., and Andrew Thompson, James, Lourdes, Jamie, Mark, Dylan, Cheryl, Stephanie, and Loretta. Mary Ann. If you're keeping a rough count of the years, that spread runs from 1963 all the way to 2016. A little over half a century of Illinois disappearances that none of the responsible agencies have ever formally closed. Some of these names you may have already known, especially Stacy's. Most of them, I'd guess, were new to you tonight, and that gap between the one household name and the 11 or 12 you'd never heard before is really the whole reason this video exists. That's out of dozens of cases active in Illinois alone right now, out of thousands across the country, going back more than 60 years just in the stories we covered today. I picked these cases because between them, they cover almost every version of vanished that exists. A mother of 2 who never made it to help a friend paint a house. 2 sisters who left a note about walking to the store and never came home from a South Side apartment. An entire family erased from a Chicago home within days of each other by someone they'd let move in. A man briefly found alive and confused 90 miles from home before slipping away again. A woman whose federal investigation may or may not have had anything to do with her disappearance. A young woman whose fate might be sitting in a specific gravel pit that's already been searched and come up empty. A hotel banquet captain whose belongings kept surfacing years apart with nothing to connect them. A young man whose only crime was a probation violation he probably never even knew about. A cluster of women from the same stretch of Peoria whose only connection might be nothing more than terrible timing, and a 16-year-old girl in 1963 who sent one letter from a shopping suburb and then went silent for the rest of her life. Read together like this, one after another. they stop looking like isolated bad luck and start looking like something closer to a pattern in how these cases get handled, if not in how they happen. A confrontation the police were already called for once. A vehicle abandoned somewhere it shouldn't have been. A story that changed every time it got told. A tip that never got verified either way. A family that had to fight year after year just to keep a detective returning their calls. None of that is unique to Illinois. It's the same shape you'd find if you did this exercise in almost any state in the country. But it's worth naming plainly because it's the closest thing to a common thread that any of these cases actually have. What ties all of them together isn't a suspect, or a theory, or a pattern you can point to and say, that's the answer, that explains everything. What ties them together is that somewhere right now, there's a sister, a mother, a grandparent, a cousin, still checking in with detectives every year on the anniversary, still hoping that somebody watching a video like this one, years or even decades later, remembers one detail they never thought to mention before. I also want to say something about the span of time we've actually covered tonight, because I don't think it fully sinks in until you say it out loud. Mary Ann Switowski disappeared before the Beatles had their first American #1. The Thompson family disappeared the same summer the Atlanta Olympics were happening. Stacy Peterson disappeared during the same news cycle that was covering the early days of the 2008 presidential primaries. These aren't stories clustered in one bad decade for the state of Illinois. They're spread across more than 60 years, from a 16-year-old at a church carnival in 1963 to a young man's car crash on a rural highway in 2016, which means the machinery that keeps these cases alive, the databases, the volunteer networks, the willingness of local news to run an anniversary story one more time, has had to survive multiple entire generations of technology and public attention just to still be standing today. That it has says something. So does the fact that not one of these cases has ever officially been closed. That's really the only reason I put this together. Not for the mystery of it, and not to treat anyone's worst day as entertainment. It's because somebody out there might know something small, a car, a name, a conversation half remembered from a long time ago, a face that's bothered them for years without knowing why, and might not realize it matters until they hear the story laid out plainly like this, all in one place. If anything in here rang a bell for you, even a little, even something you're not entirely sure is worth mentioning, call it in. Every department and agency named in this video still has these cases open. Every single one of them would rather take 100 calls that lead nowhere than miss the one call that doesn't. And if you have a missing loved one of your own who isn't in this video, look into getting their case entered into NAMUS and having your own DNA on file. It costs you nothing, and it's exactly the kind of thing that's quietly solved cases decades after everyone stopped expecting an answer. To every family behind every name we covered tonight, and every name we didn't have room for, I hope this reaches someone who knows something. I hope it reaches them soon. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. Take care of each other out there. One more thing before the credits actually roll, because I think it's easy to watch something like this and feel a little helpless afterward. Like, okay, you've heard a dozen names now, plus a family of 4, plus a whole cluster of women from Peoria, and you're sitting there thinking, I don't know anything about any of these people. What am I supposed to do with that? Here's the honest answer. Probably nothing directly. Most people watching this were nowhere near Bolingbrook in 2007 or Peoria in the 1990s, or that carnival at St. Priscilla's in 1963. That's fine. That's expected. But there are still a few things worth doing with an hour like this one, beyond just watching it and moving on. First, share it, or at least share the names. Cold cases stay cold in part because attention moves on. A case that gets talked about, searched for, mentioned in some other context 5 or 10 years from now, has a better chance of someone connecting a dot than a case that just sits quietly in a filing cabinet. You don't need to be a detective to keep a name circulating. That's most of what actually keeps these cases alive between the moments when new evidence shows up. Illinois actually has an active volunteer community doing exactly this. Pages and databases run entirely by unpaid people whose only job is making sure names like these don't quietly disappear from public memory the way the people themselves did. Second, if you live in Illinois or you're from one of the towns mentioned here, it genuinely is worth asking around, especially with older relatives. A lot of these cases are old enough that the people who might remember something are getting older themselves, and a detail that seemed unimportant in 1963 or 1994 might read completely differently to someone hearing it today for the first time. I'd bet money that somewhere in Peoria right now, there's a person in their 60s or 70s who remembers something about a woman leaving a bar called Memories in the summer of 1995, and has never once thought to mention it to anybody because it never occurred to them that it mattered. The same is probably true in Chicago's Park Manor neighborhood, or in Oak Park, or in the small towns surrounding Rantoul and Paxton. Ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unknowingly sitting on the one detail that would finally change a family's decades of not knowing. Third, and this is the practical one, if there's someone in your own life who's missing, even if their case isn't well known, even if it's not attached to a hashtag or a nonprofit or a Facebook group with thousands of members, get them into NamUs if they aren't already. It's free, it's run by the Department of Justice, and it exists specifically so that missing persons cases and unidentified remains cases across the entire country can be automatically cross-referenced against each other today, and for as long as both records exist. A lot of families don't know this system exists, or don't know that they, as next of kin, can request a DNA sample be added to a missing relative's profile. That single step is quietly responsible for a growing number of identifications in cold cases across the country every single year, precisely because it doesn't depend on any one detective remembering to check any one database by hand. None of that guarantees an answer. I want to be honest about that instead of pretending otherwise. Some of the people in this video may never be found, no matter what anyone does from here forward. But may never be found, and will definitely never be found, are two very different sentences. And every single one of these cases has stayed open specifically because nobody involved, not the families, not the detectives, not the volunteers running these databases in their spare time, has been willing to let the first sentence collapse into the second. I'll say one last thing, and then I really will let you go. A lot of us watch videos like this one and walk away thinking mostly about the mystery. Who did it? What happened? How does a person just disappear? Those are fair questions, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being curious about them. But if there's one thing I'd rather you take away from the last little while, it's not the mystery. It's the ordinariness sitting right underneath it. Almost every single case tonight started with something completely unremarkable. A short walk to a corner store, a night out with a friend, a drive back to college, a party a few towns over, a carnival at a neighborhood church. None of these people did anything different from what any of us do constantly, without a second thought. That's the part that should stay with you longer than any of the specific details. Not that the world is especially dangerous, but that none of us ever really know, in the moment, which ordinary Tuesday is going to turn out to matter. Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. I hope tonight's story gave you a deeper appreciation for the people who sought the truth, and compassion for the families whose lives were forever changed. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, I'd be honored to have you join me again. Next time, we'll journey to another state and discover another story. Every night has a story,